We have covered the turbulent history that our ancestors faced in part 1, but what about the day-to-day life of that time? Our human life cycle covers rural Ireland in the early 1900s and travels through several phases, including birth, school, religion, marriage, family and finally death. We will try to show what is going on in the rural situation during their lifetime. Typically, rural women gave birth at home as they had no access to hospitals, and they relied on family members or neighbours with delivery experience. This exposed the mothers to risk, and newborn mortality was common. The Catholic Church's religious teachings encouraged a very high birth rate. This is illustrated in our own ancestry, as there were 3 Martin brothers, Eugene, James and Michael, who fathered a total of 29 children between them, and this included at least 3 infant deaths that we know of. The constant bearing of children must have had a major physical and emotional effect on mothers, impacting their health and emotional well-being. Childbirth is a physically demanding and painful experience, and these women endured labour pains without the benefit of pain relief methods, relying instead on natural coping mechanisms and support from those around them. Children were baptised in church by a priest very soon after birth, generally being named after a saint or a close relative. Primary education has been in place since 1831 with a system of primary schools. Many of these schools, like the one in King's Court, were usually 1 or 2 room buildings that looked like large houses. This small school in King's Court was typical of the time and would have educated all of the Martin family children. Children were usually taught basic reading, writing and arithmetic skills by a single teacher who instructed students of various ages and abilities together. Attendance at school was not mandatory, and many children from rural families had to help with farm work or household chores, which could limit their ability to attend regularly. Additionally, families often faced financial challenges that made it difficult to afford school fees or supplies. So although rural children leaving school at 14 would have received some education, it would have been very basic and would have limited future opportunities for advancement. The Martin family was known to have originated in the area around the small town of King's Court, County Cavan. In the mid-1800s, rural towns tended to be laid out without much planning, but King's Court was a bustling market or post town of around 1,700 inhabitants, on the road between Baileyborough and Carrickmacross. Thanks to the Pratt family, the local landlords had established one long, wide street lined with cottages, together with a central market house complete with a clock tower. Over time, the original mud-walled thatched cabins were replaced by simple stone-built and slated houses. Typically, there were few shops, several taverns, as well as a blacksmith and a harness maker. Such towns were dirty and unhealthy. Livestock, especially pigs and hens, were kept in many houses and frequently wandered the streets. Regular fairs attracted traders and sellers from near and far, and in general, fair days witnessed scenes of mayhem, drunkenness, and not a little debauchery. From what we can gather, our ancestors were poor subsistence farmers, eking out a precarious existence on small patches of land, generally planted with potatoes, which were the family's primary food source. Or perhaps they worked the land for a landlord, who would rent them a small piece of land with the house. Houses were generally built of mud or rough stone, with a thatched roof and a wicker basket used as the chimney. There was typically only one room in these houses, where several generations of the family slept, ate and lived. They would often share the house with a pig, which would be fattened to be sold each year to pay for rent to the landlord. A hole in the ground outside the front door was used to dump rubbish, slops, manure and human waste. This slop hole provided food for the pig and was used as fertilizer for the potatoes. It was also a source of illness and disease for the family. Overall, rural living conditions were marked by a simple agrarian way of life, where families totally dependent on the land and relied on traditional practices to meet their basic needs. Religion played a large part in family life, with the vast majority of Irish people being Roman Catholics. Religious practices were deeply ingrained in daily life, with regular attendance at Mass and a strong adherence to Catholic rituals and sacraments. The church was central to the community, where everyone met on a weekly basis at Mass and on other religious feast days. The church was also heavily involved in charitable institutions that looked after the poor, the ill and the old in a society that had no social welfare. Religious orders ran orphanages and other charitable institutions in the country, and thousands of people benefited from their care. Catholicism was deeply embedded in the daily lives of families, influencing their beliefs, practices and community interactions, giving them a deep sense of faith, community and cultural identity. All courtship was linked to marriage and traditionally governed what was deemed to be acceptable behaviour between the sexes. Couples were usually matched for marriage through their parents. Young men seeking to court a woman would often approach her family first, seeking their approval and demonstrating their intentions. The love lives of our ancestors were largely regulated by society, and courting had to be socially sanctioned, polite and ritualised. A wedding was a traditional affair involving everyone in the local community. The ceremony took place in a local church, with the bride and groom arriving separately. The reception, held in a community hall or a family home, featured traditional Irish dishes like roast meats, potatoes and homemade bread. Local musicians played their lively Irish tunes, filling the air with dancing and merriment. Toasts and speeches honoured the newlyweds and their families. The festivities often extended over several days, bringing together the entire community to celebrate love, unity and the rich traditions of rural Ireland. Family survival was based on subsistence farming, and each member of the family had a vital role in tending to the land and their livestock. Both adults and children toiled together in the fields, sowing seeds, tending crops and caring for animals. In the evenings, families gathered around the hearth for a simple meal, as well as a moment of respite from the day's labours. The Catholic Church expected couples to fulfil their marital duties by procreating and raising children. All forms of birth control were illegal, and as a result, many couples had little control over the number of children they had. Large families were seen as necessary for farm work and taking care of elderly family members. However, the high birth rate contributed to poverty, overcrowding. This trend was apparent in our ancestors, as Eugene, James, Michael and Mary Martin had a total of 33 children between them, and many of the following generations continued to have quite large families themselves. Life was tough and life expectancy was relatively low compared to modern standards, with high birth rates of infants and childhood mortality because of poor living conditions and lack of health care. Adults, particularly those engaged in manual labour, such as agricultural workers, faced higher risks of injury and illness, which could significantly impact their life expectancy. Death was regarded with solemnity and reverence, and families typically held wake ceremonies to mourn the deceased and celebrate their lives. Wakes involved gatherings of family, friends and neighbours at the deceased person's home, where prayers were offered, stories were shared and food and drink were served. After the wake, the deceased was typically buried in a local cemetery, often on a family plot. Catholic teachings influenced funeral rites, with prayers for the deceased soul and the hope of eternal life being central themes. Mourners would gather at the graveside for a final farewell, offering prayers and blessings as the deceased was laid to rest. It is hoped that this video gives you an insight into the extremely hard lives faced by our ancestors. In order to draw parallels, we must recognise shared human experiences between historical challenges and contemporary contexts. Comparing this life to the present highlights the remarkable advancements and improvements in areas such as healthcare, technology and living standards. Reflecting on the challenges faced by past generations should foster gratitude for the progress we've made and an awareness of the privileges and opportunities available today. By finding common ground with the experiences of our ancestors in Ireland, we can gain insights into our own lives, appreciate our progress and draw inspiration for addressing present-day challenges.